Welcome everyone to another installment of our Wednesday webinar series, Lunch with the Birds, presented by the Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative. My name is Amanda Duran, and I am the program coordinator for OBCI. And again, I just want to welcome you and thank you for joining us today. Before I get started introducing our speaker for today, I wanted to let you all know about next month's webinar. And the topic for that will be eBird 101, an introduction to eBird with Ken Ostermiller. We're very excited to be able to offer this presentation to you. Ken is the Ohio eBird Hotspots reviewer, and he will be covering things like how to sign up for eBird, how to get a list of birds you might see in a particular area, how to see where birds are being seen on the map, and he'll also be demoing My eBird for us. So I would invite you to go ahead and visit our website, obcinet.org/lunchwiththebirds, to sign up for that free webinar, which will be on December 18th, again from 12 to 1 p.m. I would also like to invite all of you, I hope you'll enjoy today's presentation, and if you want to share a recording of it, it'll be available again at our website there at the link that you see. And if you're interested in receiving email updates about upcoming webinars, there's a listserv you can sign up for there, and we'll send you once a month a quick update on our upcoming topic. So I'm also very excited to introduce today's speaker. Marnie Tichnell is the Wildlife Program Specialist for OSU Extension, and she has statewide responsibilities for that position in outreach and education. She has BS and an MS from Ohio State University in Wildlife and Forestry, and she has a passion for public outreach education, which she realized through working for Columbus and Franklin County Metro Parks as a naturalist. In 2007, she accepted her current position with Extension, and she works to provide a variety of educational programs, workshops, conferences, and publications centered on wildlife ecology and biology, habitat management for wildlife, and managing nuisance wildlife species. She offers other programs and workshops on forest songbird management, creating backyard habitat for birds, and managing the impact of invasive species on wildlife. So with that, I'm going to bring up Marnie's presentation here. And welcome, Marnie.
Very nice introduction, and hello to everybody out there. Really excited to be here and also to talk about Ohio's woodpeckers. This is such a very interesting and just neat group of birds. So I always have a good time talking about them, and I hope you enjoy your lunch hour today. So without further ado, we'll get going. So we're going to talk about a lot of different things today. We're actually going to spend a good amount of time on the just amazing suite of characteristics that woodpeckers have that enable them to live the way that they do. And then we will definitely do a little bit about woodpecker habitat, the food, the water, resources that they need to survive. And we'll definitely talk about Ohio's woodpeckers, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end to touch real briefly on attracting woodpeckers and a little bit on when woodpeckers become a nuisance, which sometimes they unfortunately do. So woodpeckers have earned the title Nature's Power Tool, and we're going to spend some time talking about why they've earned this nickname. They are a very, very highly specialized group of birds. They are nature's carpenters, the carpenters of the bird world, and they're not just excavating cavities for themselves, but they're also excavating cavities for many other wildlife species that aren't able to make their own homes. So they specialize in that kind of excavation. They also specialize in excavating insects. So they are often able to extract insects from the center or inside trees with very impressive precision. So we'll talk about that as well. I just wanted to start by kind of scaling back a little bit from Ohio and looking at the woodpecker family as a whole. I'm sure many of you on the call today are probably more familiar with the woodpeckers of the United States and in Ohio. So I did kind of want to on some other worldwide woodpeckers. So the woodpecker family, it belongs to the order Picidae, and this is a rather large order of land birds. It's second in size only to the Picidae, our songbirds, and there are 8 different families within this order, the largest of which is the Picidae, or our woodpecker family. And there are about 200 or so species in this family, and most of them are concentrated in the tropics. And there are 4 subfamilies, and that's kind of what you're looking at right there under that first set of bullet points. So there are the piculets, and there are 2 subfamilies of piculets. And so can everybody see my pointer? Amanda, can you see the pointer on the screen? Well, I'm not sure.
No, the pointer is not visible. It's just to you.
Just to me. Okay. So the piculet is the bird on the left side of the screen, and it has a little red crest with some salt and pepper on the top of its head. So that is the white-barred piculet. And this group of birds, about 29 or so different species, and you'll find them in Central and South America, and there are a few species in Asia and one in Africa. But behaviorally, they tend to climb around trees like nuthatches, so up and down vertically is how they tend to move, looking for insects. And the other group, so the wrynecks, that would be the pictures on the right side, the upper picture of kind of a dark brown mottled bird, and then right below it with kind of a rosy red breast. That would be the Eurasian wryneck on top and the red-throated wryneck on the bottom. And these birds, like the true woodpeckers, they have larger heads, they have long tongues, which they use to extract prey. But what they do lack is more of the stiff tail feathers that our woodpeckers in the U.S. and in Ohio use to help them perch vertically on trees. So you tend to see this group of birds in the woodpecker family perching more on horizontal surfaces, just like you see here in these pictures. What's kind of neat about the wrynecks is, if you notice, their genus is Jinx, and there's kind of a neat story associated with how they got that genus name as well as their common name, wrynecks. And that has to do with their ability to turn their head almost 180 degrees. So when they are disturbed or threatened, for example, when a female is on the nest and she is disturbed, she will whip her head around really, really quickly and hiss at the same time. So it almost looks kind of like a snake in a defensive position. So this kind of odd behavior led to their supposed use in witchcraft, or as we might have heard before, put a jinx on someone. So I can't back that up with any amount of credibility, but it's just a neat story that I came across that I thought I would share with you. And finally, so the last of the subfamilies, 4 subfamilies in the family Picidae would be the Picids, which is our woodpeckers and our sapsuckers. And in the United States, we have 22 species and 7 species in Ohio. There is an amount of diversity in this family. So what you're looking at here are on the left side the smallest and largest woodpeckers worldwide, and then the smallest and largest woodpeckers in the United States. So worldwide, the smallest is the bar-breasted piculet, and you'll find this guy in South America. Largest would be the imperial woodpecker, which may be extinct now, though there are some that disagree. But it was last confirmed in 1956 in Durango, Mexico. Because of where it was seen, it was nicknamed the Mexican Ivory-Billed Woodpecker. So this is the largest in the world. The second largest in the world is the Ivory-Billed woodpecker, and we'll talk about that guy in just a little bit, but that one is also believed to be extinct. So following that would be the Pileated Woodpecker. So the Pileated Woodpecker is the largest woodpecker we have in the United States, and it's also our largest woodpecker in Ohio. And if anybody is wondering whether you say Pileated or Pileate, both pronunciations are correct. And then, of course, you have our Downy Woodpecker, which is our smallest in the U.S. and also in Ohio. And just to give you a little bit of size reference, the Downy Woodpecker is about 5.5 to 6.5 inches in length, and then the bar-breasted piculet is about 3 to 4 inches. So not a whole lot smaller, but definitely a little bit smaller. I mentioned the Ivory-Billed Woodpecker story. If you're a birder out there, I'm sure you are familiar with this story, but it's kind of a topic of a lot of controversy. So the Ivory-Billed Woodpecker was the largest woodpecker north of Mexico, and habitat-wise it was found in mature forest in the southeast United States, but due to loss of habitat, loss of that forested habitat, we started seeing some severe population declines in the 1800s, and once we got into the 20th century, into the mid-1900s, there were only a handful of these birds left. So scientific community believes it extinct since the mid-1900s. However, there was a rediscovery or potential rediscovery in Arkansas in 2005, and I'm not going to go into a lot of the details, but there is a lot of controversy over this rediscovery, and there has still not been any agreement over whether or not it really was sighted. Some people will say, no, it definitely wasn't, and they believe it to be a sighting of a pileated woodpecker, which is the bottom picture of that screen, or on my screen. You'll see that's a picture of a pileated woodpecker in flight, and you can probably see how there are some definite similarities. So if you don't have a nice, good visual of an ivory bill, it can be mistaken for the pileated. So if you're interested in more details about this, I would definitely encourage you to look into it. It's an interesting situation. But getting on to the woodpeckers, as I said, I wanted to spend some time talking about all of their unique adaptations and characteristics that enable them to live their lifestyles. And they are very successful in their lifestyles. So why is that? They have a lot of adaptations, and I have them listed here, and we're going to go over those in a little bit more detail. So these really are woodpeckers, as I said, they're really amazing animals. They are able to create these large, sometimes gaping holes in one of nature's most solid and durable of materials, wood. And they do it without causing damage to themselves. So how is that possible? One of the reasons is they are the world's best shock absorber. So I wanted to go into a little bit of detail on the strength and speed of the impact when a woodpecker is colliding with a tree, as you can see in that picture. So they can be colliding with a tree as fast as 100 times per minute at speeds from 12 to 15 miles per hour, which is pretty impressive. That third point down, so they will peck with a force of 600 to 1,500 Gs. So a little bit more detail on that. So right now, as we sit here eating our lunch at our desks, we are experiencing 1 G, which G is the force of gravity. A fighter pilot has to go through pretty extensive training to be able to withstand 10 Gs. And humans, we will get a concussion after we experience 100 Gs. In fact, it's anywhere from 80 to 100 Gs. So the fact that a woodpecker is going 600 to 1,500 Gs, that's pretty impressive. And not only that, but if you've ever watched woodpeckers, you know they'll be pecking on wood and they'll just stop abruptly. They'll just completely stop after going at such strength and speed. So accelerating after 1,200 Gs, that bulletin point you're looking at right now, decelerating after 1,200 Gs would be the equivalent of us coming to a complete stop from going 26,000 miles per hour. Okay, so trying to put it in terms that we might understand, it's really impressive what these guys are doing. So the question is, how are they able to do this without suffering some type of brain damage on a daily, if not hourly basis? Well, there's lots of different reasons why, and I'll go through each of these. So the first is this frontal bone in the skull. And this frontal bone really helps to keep the upper bill in place. So like other birds, in a woodpecker, the upper bill is movable, which allows it to move independently of the skull. Now, this free movement could definitely be a liability if the woodpecker were to be pecking into a tree, crash its bill into the tree, and the force could potentially force that bill back all the way into the skull of the bird and kill it. So that would be bad. So they have to have something that prevents that from happening, and that's what frontal bone does. So the frontal bone, if you're looking at the picture of the bird skull, it's kind of that projection in the skull right above the bill, and it's a little bit bumpy. So that's what you're looking at there. And in certain species of woodpeckers, depending on how often they excavate, that bone can be more pronounced. So the picture of the northern fur below that bird skull, you'll see that that frontal bone, you can't really tell. It looks kind of smooth, but when you contrast it to the picture on the right side, and that's of a black-backed woodpecker, you can kind of see that frontal bone projecting a little bit more. Okay, so that's one of the ways woodpeckers protect themselves from damage. Another reason is they have a little bit of extra cartilage for a little bit of cushion. So they have some cartilage between the bill and the skull that helps absorb the shock. And they also have a protractor muscle. Again, that muscle's there to absorb the shock of that pecking. Not only that, but woodpeckers have perfect aim. When they're delivering a blow into a tree, it's almost always a very perfect right angle. So their bill colliding with the trunk of the tree is at a nice 90-degree angle. And that really prevents the head from rotating and the bill from possibly glancing off and causing injuries. So that straight blow really helps to deliver that shock wave through that protractor muscle and that cartilage that helps absorb the shock. But what it also does is it delivers that shock wave through the skull, and it actually travels below the brain. So it's not even if there's any excess vibrations from that shock, it isn't even touching the brain. So that's another way that woodpeckers prevent brain damage. Last but not least, they have a tiny padded brain. So it's not very big, and it's packed very tightly into the skull, so there's not a lot of extra movement. Not only that, but it's small, so it lacks the mass that it really needs to develop enough inertia or enough movement to move around and cause damage. So if you think of our brains, we have a significant amount of mass to our brains. So when we shake our heads very violently or when we get a blow delivered to our head, our brains are heavy enough that it'll move around and cause damage. Okay. So those are just some of the, and not all of them, but some of the biggest reasons why woodpeckers are good shock absorbers and why they are able to do what they do without causing brain damage. Okay, so we'll go over some other adaptations in their lifestyles. So a little extra muscle never hurts for delivering the strength that they have to chisel in wood. So a lot of birds have 6 pairs of ribs in their rib cage and 2 pairs of neck ribs. And in woodpecker, the end rib, and that's the pink one that's highlighted in that picture, is just a little bit wider and a little bit heavier than you'll find in other birds. And that just allows more muscles and larger, stronger muscles to be attached to that rib. So again, just giving that bird extra strength as it's chiseling into wood. So we can't talk about woodpeckers and not talk about the tongue, because the tongue bone and the tongue itself is just really, really neat. So the tongues of birds are quite different from those of mammals, or at least they have some unique differences when compared to mammals. So they're composed of these long, slender, flexible bones with a fleshy tip. And if you're looking kind of the bottom picture there, bottom right picture, you'll see the entire hyoid apparatus, and that's what it's called when you combine the bone and the fleshy muscle together. And you'll notice in woodpeckers, that whole apparatus wraps all the way around the bird's head. So it splits kind of at the base or beginning of the throat, and it wraps all the way up around and meets at the nostrils. And on the bony part of the hyoid apparatus, that's where muscles are attached. So those muscles, and now look at the bottom right picture, when those muscles are relaxed, you can see it on the top there, when they're contracted, the wood tongue shoots out of its mouth. So it actually ends up coming out more like a spear, which is very, very good at trapping insects and probing deep into the holes that they're pecking into. So we as humans, in case you're wondering, we also have a hyoid bone and an apparatus. So if you can kind of feel under your chin, and if you stick your tongue in and out, you can feel your hyoid, the muscles attached to that bone, contracting and restricting. So take a second and do that. We have the same type of thing as woodpeckers do. So moving on to the tip of the tongue of woodpeckers, this also is why woodpecker tongues are so special. So if you look at the tip of different species, they're very different. So first of all most of our woodpeckers, the tips of their tongues are very, very sensitive. They're packed with nerve endings. And if you think about it, this makes sense because a lot of times they're pecking into the wood and they can't really see their food. So they do have to rely on a very sensitive tongue tip to get into that bark and really feel around for the food. And as you start to look at different species, for example, the northern flicker, which is up at the upper right picture, the northern flicker has very sticky saliva that will help to trap insects onto the tongue, kind of like fly paper. And also the saliva of the northern flicker is alkaline-based, which can counter the acidic defenses of some ants. And ants are a species that northern flickers definitely like to eat. Some woodpecker species have very hairy tips to their tongue. So if you look down to the bottom on the left side, that is the yellow-bellied sapsucker. And you'll see a close-up of his tongue. He kind of has hair-like projections on the tongue. And this makes sense because if you know about the yellow-bellied sapsucker, just like their name implies, they like to eat sap. So these hair-like, brushy kind of projections on the tip of their tongue work just like a paintbrush would to soak up paint. So that helps to soak up that sap that they like to eat. And last but not least, one of my favorites is the red-bellied woodpecker, and he has, or she, has a very sharp pointed tip to his tongue tip, and there are actually barbs on that tip that are pointed backwards, which very effectively, as you see in that picture, spear insects. Of course, the overall shape of the beak is also an advantage to woodpeckers, and you'll see that in a lot of different bird species. The shape and the length of the size is always important. That northern cardinal you'll see there on the top row of birds, going from the left to the right, the northern cardinal, very nice strong bill that helps it crack open seeds. And then you have flycatchers in that middle picture, smaller kind of bills for catching insects on the wing. And of course the hummingbird, that last picture, has a very long and narrow bill to help it get inside to the nectar of flowers. And the same is true for our woodpecker. They have a very kind of longer, sharp bill to help them chisel to wood. But in addition to that, their bill is self-sharpening. So the bony inner structure of the bill is covered with a leathery-like sheath that is constantly growing our fingernails. And when a woodpecker is just doing what it does on a daily basis, chiseling into wood, that helps to constantly sharpen or file down that bill to a very sharp point. So that's an adaptation that they have to keep that bill working to the best of its ability. Like any good human carpenter, you definitely need a pair of safety glasses to protect you. Maybe not so much nose protection for us, but if you're a woodpecker and you are using your bill to chisel into wood, you probably want a little bit of nose protection to prevent things from getting up in there. So they do have some feathers to protect their nostrils and also help to filter in some air. And I think those feathers most prominently seen on our downy, like you see there in that top picture, and our hairy woodpeckers. They also have, so their eyes themselves are kind of like we talked about their brains, very tightly packed and tightly fit into the skull. And so that prevents any movement, movement of those eyes when they're pecking into the wood, so that prevents injury. And as I was kind of reading this topic a year or so ago, I came across a paper from the medical community where they were comparing eye damage of babies that suffered from shaken baby syndrome to the eyes of woodpeckers, and they were looking at, well, why are human babies, why do they have damage to the eyes and woodpeckers don't? So I always find it really interesting when we pull from the wildlife world and look at their unique adaptations and kind of apply it to our world. Woodpeckers also so they a lot of times will blink their eyes when they're pecking into woods, and there's been some evidence to kind of believe that this is kind of a seat belt. So when they close that eyelid, it just tightens everything down and protects the eye even more. They also have very well positioned eyes. So if you make your life a woodpecker, if your eyes were positioned in the front of your head, you would spend your days looking at the trunk of a tree, which isn't going to help them too much to avoid predators. So their eyes are positioned on either side of their head to help them stay alert, and they do see quite well and in color. Moving on down the body of the woodpecker, so we have to talk about their feet and their tail feathers, and I apologize, there's a picture that's kind of covered up there, but it's just a close-up picture of the foot woodpecker, and you can see it in that front picture right there. But they have zygodactyl toes, which means they have 2 toes that point forward and 2 that point backwards. And this just helps them hold on to the tree trunk. It gives them that stability and that strength that they need. And I tell you, I'm a rock climber, and I have to really respect woodpeckers because it is very difficult to hold on to a vertical surface. So their feet help them do that, and their tail is also really important to help give them that balance and that strength that they need. So their tail is really kind of the third leg of a tripod when they're on the vertical surface of a tree right there. And when we closer look at their tails, most woodpeckers have about 12 feathers in their tails. The center 2 feathers are usually the strongest and the longest, and you can kind of see them on that bottom picture of a red-bellied woodpecker. Those their tail feathers, they're very strong. They have more pointed tips, a very strong kind of reinforced shaft, and strong interlocking barbs. Again, just all of these adaptations and characteristics make those feathers strong enough so they can use it as balance and strength when they're perching vertically. Interestingly, when it comes to molting, lots of our birds have to molt their feathers to grow in new ones and stronger ones to make sure they can fly and everything like that. And a lot of our birds will molt their tail feathers from the center outward. But woodpeckers are different. In order to maintain maximum strength and support, woodpeckers will molt their feathers from the second innermost part out. So they'll leave those center 2 strongest feathers till the very end until all of the other feathers are in good working order so they can keep doing what they're doing out there. The coloration of woodpeckers is another adaptation that just helps to keep them safe. So a lot of our woodpeckers have kind of this mottled appearance. They have bars or spots on their back, and that is just to conceal them from predators when they're on the trunk of a tree. And that contrast helps them blend in and helps to break out their outline and make them less detectable to predators. So I hope you found all the many adaptations of woodpeckers as interesting and fascinating as I do. What I want to move into next is talking a little bit about habitat needs of woodpeckers and kind of go over the life of a woodpecker and what they're doing out there besides chiseling into wood. And I'm mostly going to be talking in respect to Ohio woodpeckers, and I'll throw in a few other U.S. species just because they're interesting as well. But just to go over our different species that we have here in Ohio, and we will start from the upper left side of the screen. So upper left you have the Pileated Woodpecker, and then moving right you have the Yellow-bellied Sapsucker, and then up in the upper right is the Red-bellied Woodpecker, and then kind of right below that with a blue background, that's your northern flicker. And then going down to the bottom right, you have the red-headed woodpecker, and that's why the red-bellied woodpecker isn't called the red-headed woodpecker, because there is another species that has that name. And then moving towards the left side on the bottom, you have the hairy woodpecker with a little bit of an insect in his mouth, and then you have the downy woodpecker right outside that excavated cavity. So those are our Ohio woodpeckers. And we'll talk about those species in more detail at the end here. So woodpecker habitat needs, there is a picture that's covered up. I apologize. What you would have seen is just some pileated woodpeckers excavating some cavities in a larger tree. So what woodpeckers really need, they do need a tree. I think that's obvious. I think all of us know that. They need them for nesting, and they also need them for feeding. And general rule of thumb, the larger the woodpecker, the larger the tree needed. Though I have seen pileated woodpecker holes on some smaller trees. So that's not always case. There is one exception to the rule, and so the Gila woodpecker, you see there in that picture, this is a western species, but they tend to use saguaro cactuses as their nesting and feeding sites. A little bit different situation here. The cactus is pulpy and moist on the inside, so it takes these guys a little bit longer to excavate their cavities or to use their cavities because they have to wait for it to dry out. When we talk about food, I think all of us know that insects are the main food of woodpeckers. They will eat all stages of woodpecker or of insects, so eggs, larvae, and the adult stages of the insects. Depending on the woodpecker, there are a few preferences. So northern flickers tend to really like ants and beetles. One researcher reported 3,000 ants in the stomach of a flicker. So they're eating a lot of these insects. So that's one benefit we need to be aware of that our woodpeckers are providing us. Moths and butterflies are also prey to woodpeckers as well as spiders. And then there's other food sources. So woodpeckers do supplement their diet with other things, not just insects. So red-bellied woodpeckers, a little known fact, they do predate bird eggs and nestlings. So you will have other animals in the diet of some of our woodpecker species. Fruit, woodpeckers won't pass up some berries, like you see that downy woodpecker feeding on some berries on that lower picker. And then hard mast, so acorns, seeds, and nuts are also important for our woodpeckers. The red-headed woodpecker especially will cache nuts over the winter. So there are a few species of woodpeckers that will cache nuts. The picture that you're looking at is an acorn woodpecker, and this is another western species. And a really neat species that will drill acorn-sized holes into trees and other areas, like this utility pole that you see here. So it'll make a small little hole for each individual acorn. And each family of woodpeckers will have a primary tree, so a main tree or post like you see here where they will cache their acorns. And they call that a granary, granary, and depending on the size of that granary, there could be as many as 50,000 holes, each with one acorn in it. So it's kind of a really neat species. And of course, we have to talk about the yellow-bellied sapsucker. Just like its name implies, this is a species that likes to feed on sap. And it'll feed on other things. The sap diet is about 30% of its diet. So this guy is also looking to eat insects as well. But it will drill tiny holes, often vertically, as you see there on the left side of the screen, into usually shallower barked or thinner barked trees like your birch and poplar species and maples. And it's getting at the sap that is flowing up and down out of the tree. And you can kind of see on that far right how the sap is dripping down out of the tree, and it just licks it up with that tipped tongue that we talked about earlier. And what's also kind of neat is that other animals will benefit from these kind of sap wells that yellow-bellied sapsuckers are leaving behind. So you see at the bottom there's hummingbirds and also some of our Lepidoptera and our butterflies will take advantage of those sap wells. I often get questions from homeowners and woodland owners on if this damages the tree, and a lot of times it doesn't, especially because in most of the state this is a migratory species, so they're only here from about April to May before they move on. But there are some cases where extensive damage and long-term damage can end up damaging the tree, but for the most part, trees are able to handle this type of damage. So moving on from food and talking about activity levels of woodpeckers, the majority of our Ohio woodpeckers are here year-round, so they're active during the winter. The exception would be the yellow-bellied sapsucker. As I mentioned, this is our migratory woodpecker, and typically we see them in the majority of the state April through May. They're going to stop over, feed, rest. You'll see those sap wells on the trees during those months, and then they're going to move on. The exception is in the northeast part of the state. So some recent research from the Ohio Breeding Bird Atlas has found that yellow-bellied sapsuckers are sticking around in that part of the state. If you look at that range map, the orange part there, that's their summer or their breeding habitat. And what researchers have found is that range is kind of expanding southward a little bit. So it's crawled a little bit into the northeastern tip of Ohio. So if anybody's up in that area, you might have sapsuckers throughout the summer. We have to talk a little bit about communication when it comes to woodpeckers. We're definitely all familiar with songbirds and their beautiful songs. Woodpeckers have more calls and not so much songs. So while a lot of woodpeckers will have a variety of different calls, the call is usually just a single note repeated over and over, and not much a melody like our songbirds have. They're going to use those calls for a lot of different reasons, defending or defining their territories, for mating, attracting mates, and also for alarm. Drumming is what we hear during the breeding season. It's also a form of communication. But at the beginning of the breeding season, in late winter and early spring, woodpeckers will drum on a variety of different surfaces. Sometimes to the annoyance of homeowners, it'll be their home or a drain pipe or a eaves or awning or something like that, and it just makes a lot of noise. And while it just sounds like a lot of noise to us, it really relays a lot of information to surrounding woodpeckers. So if it's a male doing the drumming, then there are females of the same species that recognize that male and may even recognize that he is trying to attract a mate at that time. So getting into the mating and breeding information. So the breeding season, as I said, starts kind of here in Ohio at the end of winter and into the spring. And it starts with males securing their territories. And typically the larger the bird, the larger the territory. So a Downy Woodpecker can have a territory of 1/2 to 1 acre. Pileateds, they're going to need a little bit larger space, so 1 to 2 square miles. There will be some displays depending on the species. So you're looking at a beautiful northern flicker, and he is raising his crest feathers in a nice mating display there, trying to attract the female. Then you have cavity excavation. That's usually what happens next. Most of our woodpeckers are going to create their own cavity, though there are some species that will use existing cavities, and northern flickers to be the ones that more often will use an existing cavity, though they will create their own. As far as type of trees that they're selecting for cavities, they will choose decaying trees or live trees. The larger and stronger the woodpecker, the more likely they are to use a live tree. So pileated would be a good example of a woodpecker that would use a live tree. The male usually begins the excavating of the cavity, and he usually does most of the work, but the female will help once she has selected a mate. And some sources report that this is a type of pair bonding, so building the nest just like we humans nest and ready for a young, same thing with the woodpeckers. how long it takes to excavate the cavity, it depends on the species. Obviously, the larger species, the bigger cavity they're going to need. So, and it also depends on the level of decay that the tree is. So the softer the wood, the easier it'll be. But generally speaking, 1 to 2 weeks for our smaller species, 3 to 6 weeks for a larger species like the pileated. The entrance hole does play, can really help you identify a species of woodpecker. So if you're out in the woods and you see a hole, you can have a little bit of a clue as to what woodpecker species was using that cavity. So downy woodpeckers, 1 to 1/4 inch circle is what they tend to use. And then the pileated, you're looking at a much larger hole that's anywhere from 3.5 to 4 inches and a little bit more oval in shape. And general rule of thumb with most birds is they're going to have an entrance hole as small as possible. They don't want anything else to get into that hole except for them. So that's generally how it works. In terms of reproduction, when we talk about some species of birds, the color of their eggs is very important for camouflage purposes. So the example I like to use is a killdeer, and you're looking at what looks just a pile of rocks. But if you'll notice towards the bottom of the picture, kind of right below right below and a little to the left of that cluster of green, you'll see the 4 killdeer eggs that are camouflaged perfectly to blend into those rocks. Woodpeckers don't have to worry about that so much. They are a cavity nesting species, so they don't need, they don't really need that camouflage. So their eggs are usually just a nice, beautiful, pure white color. Most of our woodpeckers are only going to have 1 clutch a year. They're going to reproduce once a year. And the number of eggs depends on the species. So Harry's roughly about 6 eggs, red-headed 10 eggs. But woodpeckers are indeterminate egg layers, meaning that the number of eggs a female can lay is not limited. So if something were to happen to the eggs, if they were predated or stolen, they can lay more eggs soon after that happens, as long as it's not too late into the breeding season. Both of the parents will incubate, feed, and raise the young, and both have brood patches. So that bottom right picture, that's a picture of a brood patch, and that skin to egg contact is just, it really helps to really warm up those eggs. So you'll find those on both males and females. And here's just a couple pictures of some going through the whole hatching stage. So these eggs usually for a downy incubated 11 days, and they'll hatch about 20 to 28 days later, so 3 to 4 weeks later roughly. And you can kind of see when the fledgling are getting ready to fledge or to leave the nest. That's what it means to fledge. They look a lot like the parents, and that's usually the case for most of our woodpeckers. There are some exceptions, of course. The red-headed woodpecker, the juvenile of that species, has a brown head until it's fully matured. Okay, so for the rest of the time, about 10 minutes or so it looks like I have, I just need to go over a little bit more detail Ohio's woodpeckers. And I am so sorry that you can't see the text. I have the range map covering them. So just listen to me and I will tell you everything that you are unable to see. But starting with the pileated, our largest pecker, and I believe I have these organized from largest down to smallest, roughly speaking. So the pileated woodpecker, our largest, beautiful red crest you see there. If you look towards the bottom of all of these, I have the differences between males and females. So on the left is the male and the female is on the right side. So you see that her crest is just a little bit shorter and she doesn't have a mustache like you see on the male. But habitat-wise, these guys are larger tracts of mature woods, and they do like larger trees for roosting. Food-wise, they're looking for carpenter ants and a lot of wood-boring insects, as well as a lot of other invertebrates. And these guys will also eat hard mass or acorns and nuts and things like that. You can see the range map. They are fairly common across their range. And then we have the northern flicker. So the French have named these species flamboyant, and they named it that just because of the color and behavior of this bird. It's a larger, kind of noisy, but very animated. If you've ever heard a flicker out in the woods, very kind of noisy and very uniquely patterned woodpecker. We have east and north, we have the yellow-shafted woodpecker. So in the west, you have the red-shafted woodpecker. They're believed to be two different species, but now they're just kind of two different of the same type of species. The red shaft refers to the feather shafts. You can see in that picture how they're a lot redder as opposed to more yellow in our northern flickers here. And there are some differences in appearance. In the red-shafted, the males have a red mustache, whereas our northern flicker, the yellow-shafted, have a black mustache. And in terms of male versus female, don't have that black mustache on the females. So those are just some differences there. The other thing I like to point out for the northern flicker is that white rump patch. So the call of the northern flicker is pretty distinctive, but if you can't recognize that, then look for that white rump patch because that's pretty distinctive too. This is a species that likes woodlands, forest edges, with open fields with scattered trees, just about anywhere. It's common in city parks and suburbs. It's a species you see foraging more along the ground than any other woodpecker. It's looking for ants, beetles, and any other insects that it can find along the ground. It has a rather large range if you look at the range map, and it's pretty common throughout its range too. Next is the Red-bellied Woodpecker. And down at the bottom, you'll see the differences between the males and the females. So that red kind of head helmet, it doesn't extend quite far up on the female. But otherwise, a fairly distinctive woodpecker, especially with that black and white barring across the back. It does have just a little bit of a red belly. You can see on those bottom pictures kind of where the name comes from. This is also a fairly common woodpecker in a variety of different forest types, large or small. It's also more common in urban, suburban parks and green spaces. Food-wise, it's looking for insects, spiders, and other arthropods. And if you remember, I said earlier, this is a species that will sometimes prey on eggs and nestlings of other bird species. Its population, this is a woodpecker that's doing quite well. Its populations are increasing throughout most of its range, but you'll see that it's mostly in eastern species. And then we have the red-headed woodpecker, a very boldly colored bird, and it has earned the nickname of the flying checkerboard to some people. The males and females of this species are identical. That's why I don't have two different pictures. So they look the same. And habitat-wise, this guy is really looking for woodlands with oak or beech or hickory. The majority of its diet is mast, and then it supplements the rest of it. About 1/3 of its diet is insects, 2/3 mast. Particularly likes open areas, areas or woodlands that have been and by open areas, I mean woodlands that have been recently burned and harvested, creating more of an open habitat. This species was once a little bit more common throughout its range, but due to a little bit of habitat loss, it's now not quite as common. And it is often referred to as nomadic, which means it'll be in one area one year, and then the next year you may not see them. We've already talked quite a bit about the yellow-bellied sapsucker, but again, you're going to see them in most of the state from April through May. Habitat-wise, it's looking for eager forests, and that's mostly because those trees are fast-growing at that time, so there's a lot of good sap production. And as I said, sap is the primary food, but it also supplements quite a bit of it with insects, primarily ants and spiders. You'll see at the bottom differences between males and females. So you're probably starting to see some similarities. The female doesn't have the red throat patch. Other species, it's maybe that red crest or the mustache, but in this species, it's that throat patch. As far as its populations, it's fairly stable, but they do, as I said, they really like those young forests, which in Ohio are becoming harder and harder to come by. All of our forests in Ohio are maturing, and we're losing, or we don't have as many of those young forests more. The hairy woodpecker, so now we're getting into some of our more common species, feeder birds, as I call them. So hairy woodpeckers, red-bellied woodpeckers will too, but hairy and downy will frequently visit your bird feeders, especially suet feeders if you have those up during the winter. But the hairy woodpecker and the downy, they look a lot alike. Sometimes it can be difficult to tell them apart. The hairy woodpecker is larger, but I don't like that as a ID feature, just because unless you have a downy right to it, it's going to be difficult. So I tend to tell people to look at the bill. The bill of a hairy woodpecker is roughly as long as its head. The other thing to look at are the white outer tail feathers. So you can see those in a couple of the pictures. They're completely white, whereas when we get a downy, you'll often see little black dots on those whiter outer tail feathers. This species is very common in a variety of different types of woodlots, whether they're large or small, very common in urban as well as rural areas. 75% of the diet is insects, so they do rely mostly on diet, but they will supplement with seeds and suet, especially during the winter. And then you have our downy woodpecker, our smallest woodpecker. And I didn't mention the differences between the males and the females on both the downy and the hairy is that little red patch behind head on both of those species. So the downy woodpecker, the bill is a little bit smaller, maybe about 1/3 the size of the head. And I apologize, not the best of pictures, but if you look at the bottom right picture, you can kind of see a little bit of those black dots on the whiter outer tail feathers I mentioned earlier. Very numerous across its range and with some nice stable population numbers. Okay, so the last couple things I wanted to kind of talk about, attracting woodpeckers and nuisance woodpeckers. So first of all, attracting woodpeckers, as I said, trees are a requirement. So you'll want to have a woodlot nearby. And if you are a woodland owner, then making sure you have some dead or dying trees, some dead standing trees, which we often call snags, within your woodlot. That's going to be something you really want to have. And multiple stages of decay is great. The size of the woodlot is going to influence the species that you get. Remember, our larger species like the pileated, they're going to like larger tracts of land. But otherwise, you should have some downy, hairy, and red-bellied woodpeckers in there. Sometimes I get questions on nest boxes and whether you can put nest boxes out for woodpeckers. A lot of species don't tend to use them very often. The species that does would be the northern flicker. And if you recall earlier in the talk, I said that this is a species that will use existing cavities more so than other species of woodpeckers. So that's why nest boxes will sometimes attract flickers. It's something to try, but it's not a guarantee like other species of birds and nest boxes, like your bluebirds and tree swallows. Feeders and bird baths are always great ideas, especially in the winter, since most of our woodpeckers are out and about during the winter. Last but not least, nuisance woodpeckers. I don't have a lot of time to go into this. If anybody has any questions on nuisance woodpeckers, please feel free to give me a call. But that top picture is what you're looking at. That's from the acorn woodpeckers. So thankfully we don't have to deal with that type of damage. But we do have to deal with woodpeckers occasionally pecking into wood, the sidings along our home, or if you have a log cabin. A lot of times there is something in the wood they're trying to get at. So whether it's some sort of wood-boring insect, carpenter bees will especially attract woodpeckers. That should be kind of a red flag. You might need to treat your wood or something like that. Sometimes they're just pecking. So sometimes scare tactics can work to scare them away. So reflective materials like CDs, mylar tape can sometimes work. But those often require you to be very persistent and somewhat patient. Sometimes netting can work, and tactile repellents. So you can sometimes spread a sticky repellent onto the surface that woodpeckers are getting on, and they just don't like the stickiness, so they'll leave it alone. It's important to realize that woodpeckers are really helping trees, especially our hairy and downy woodpeckers. We have a lot of invasive insects coming into the scene. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with emerald ash borer. Asian long beetle is the newest, biggest bad, and these are two insects that are being predated on by woodpeckers. So yay for woodpeckers helping us out with our invasive species issues. So that's all I have for you. I wanted to, first of all, thank Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative for having me do this webinar. And what you're looking at there are just some other resources, some of my favorite resources. The All About Birds site at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology is great. Internet Center for Wildlife Damage Management, that's a good source of information for more details on nuisance woodpeckers. And then OSU Woodland Stewards, that is OSU Extension's private woodland owner program. We offer a lot of educational classes on just wildlife in your woods and tree ID and things like that. But on that website you can find fact sheets that relate to those things as well. And then my contact information.